Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today, of course, we are going to be going over the gold medal match at Socal Swordfight 2025. What will probably go down as one of the highest, if not the highest rated longsword tournament of all time. The reason for this, of course, is that in this tournament we saw the first, the second, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the eighth, the 12th, every single real fighting international member of the top 12 or top 20 in this tournament in one place at the same time, fighting each other for the coveted gold medal match. And of course, in this gold medal match, we have Antoni Olbrychski and Miro Lahtela. Anton on the right, Miro on the left. Now, if you don't already know these two people, they are very high-level prolific fencers, but each with their own distinct styles that is going to result in a very interesting matchup. Also, something to know is that this was not the only match that they fought for gold. They fought a best of 3, and this is just the first of that 3. Now, I'm not going to necessarily spoil the outcome here, but one thing I found very interesting when watching this fight is that in this fight, you see encapsulated all of the adjustments that each fencer made and the adjustments that would later on go on to make one of them the victor. So, by breaking down this match, we can pretty easily see what was going through each of these fencers' heads, why they made the decisions they made, and which ones worked and which ones didn't. So, without any more delay, let's watch the fight. Starting off with our first exchange, we have a little bit of a lame one, or at least some people consider it a little lame. I think it's genius. And the first exchange is both Miro and Olbrychski walking towards the center of the ring, just getting ready to square up with each other when Anton snipes him in the leg and walks away clean. And this gives me my first and probably best opportunity to talk about one of the things that makes Olbrychski such a prolifically good fighter, and that is his ability to subvert your expectations. He has an ability, an unprecedented, unparalleled ability to guess what sort of exchange you are looking to have just as soon as you walk into the ring and then do something that you did not see coming, something that you didn't want to happen. Anton obviously knows who Miro Lahtela is, and he knows that Miro loves his big, aggressive shots straight out of the middle. But one thing that Olbrychski also knows is that the first exchange is also one of the slower ones. Everybody, from the best to the worst, will take their time usually in their first exchange to try to feel out their opponent and figure out what's going on. And Olbrychski has done the ultimate counter to anyone who is sitting around trying to think about what to do, and that is to throw a shot somewhere where you can't parry, and as long as your intention wasn't pre-programmed to throw something in response, you're going to get hit, and you're going to look a little bit foolish. Moving on to the next important exchange, because there were like 15 of these and I have to trim some of them, is an exchange where we finally see the real game plan of each fencer played out in full. So Miro, as I mentioned earlier, loves his single-time passing step shield house to the head. He's very, very good at them, and he has made them so good that they're almost impossible for people to parry. The reason for this is that they come in vertical, straight down on top of the head, and they don't have a lot of huge range of motion. They start from the shoulder and they end pretty much in the exact same spot in terms of elevation, which means that you only have about 15 or so degrees of rotation to really get something under that Shieldhau, which means trying to parry Miro's Shieldhau by going up is basically impossible. So what you have to do instead is you have to wipe it to the side. You have to crump it. You have to push it over your other shoulder, and that has a lot of space it has to cover. So this is what Olbrychski's game plan was clearly trying to be. It was trying to counteract Miro's Shieldhau by throwing crumps. As soon as he saw him move forward, that would displace his Shieldhau off to the side, and then he would riposte to the hands. Problem is, one of the other important aspects of Miro's Shieldhau is how little, overcommitment it requires. Because it doesn't require a huge amount of commitment, with his hands, Miro is able to throw his Shieldhau, he gets parried, and then is still able to renew a new Shieldhau attack to the head at the exact same time, even though he was parried. Now, this means two particular things. One, Olbrychski's parries work, but they don't work enough. At the exact same time, as a parry-riposte, Olbrychski is almost guaranteed to get that hand shot in the afterblow because Miro's hands are still going to be out there, but he has to make sure to defend his head. Now, this is also an opportunity to talk about the rules a little bit. This is Socal Swordfight as run by Sean Franklin, and Sean Franklin is notorious for having a lot of what some people consider to be erroneous rules, but in this particular case, you can see exactly why certain rules were in place. In Sean Franklin's rules, you cannot score points on an afterblow. However, an afterblow can remove points that you might have scored. So, Olbrychski parries, ripostes to the hands, theoretically gets his points, but then has them canceled out by Miro's afterblow to the head. Meaning that while this is an exchange where no points are really given to anybody, the more important factor here is that we see Olbrychski trying to use his defensive maneuvers and his footwork to counteract Miro's offensive maneuvers. And while we do see them work in some degree, they also don't work in another degree. Immediately after that exchange, we have our next little adaptation from Olbrychski. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that Olbrychski really needs to watch out for are Miro's shieldhouse. But there's two ways to try to deal with a shieldhouse. The first is to try to parry it. And as we saw in the previous exchange, that's not working out so great. So instead of trying to parry it, what instead Olbrychski tries to do is to out-time it. So one of the aspects that makes a shieldhouse so strong is that it requires this big commitment forward with the feet, but not necessarily with the hands. As a result, by trying to play some footwork games, what Olbrychski is trying to do is make so that Miro never really has an opportunity where he feels safe to just full commit. One thing you see in this exchange is Miro gestures forward with his body, trying to show Olbrychski that he might throw that shieldhouse, and Olbrychski's response is to shuffle step out of range and put his guard up right where he knows Miro's shieldhouse is going to go. What this is essentially telling to Miro, don't throw your shieldhouse or I'm going to parry it. And so, as a result, he has effectively stopped Miro from throwing his favorite attack, at least in this particular exchange, just enough that he hesitates. And when he hesitates, Olbrychski capitalizes on another opportunity. And that is whenever you are throwing a shieldhouse, you have to put your hands extended forward with your crossguard in a vertical alignment, which means that your hands are open. So what the plan now here from Olbrychski is to basically bait out the committed shieldhouse from Miro and snipe the hands as he comes in. Something that is successful in this particular exchange. So now going into this next exchange, you might think that it's Miro's turn to make an adaptation, but you would be wrong. And this is again where I need to talk about the real game plan, the real meta plan that makes Olbrychski such an effective fencer. And that again is his ability to subvert your expectations of an exchange. Normally, any even high level fencer would expect that now that Olbrychski has gained a point and has started to really make some of his game plans work, he would stick with that plan and wait for Miro to respond in turn. But that's not what happens. Instead, Olbrychski takes the expectation that he will be defensive, given that the two things that have somewhat worked for him so far is either a parry-riposte or a hand snipe on the way in. Miro will be the one who aggresses, he will move backwards, and he will simply try to execute one of those game plans again. Instead, he lunges full send into a big thrust. And this is a really, really smart adaptation because it completely negates whatever game plan Miro might have had for trying to overwhelm the defense of Olbrychski. If he had, for example, decided that, okay, instead of going in for my classic shieldhouse, I'm going to feint him and feint him and feint him and back him into the edge of the ring where he no longer has any space to back up, this thrust straight from cold open is a perfect counter to that, because any instance in which you come forward and you feint but you don't do anything is an instance where you can be attacked. So Olbrychski goes for his big thrust, and it looks like he gets parried. It doesn't quite work out for him. And in my opinion, this is, of course, an expectation and a really, really great showcase of Miro's ability to also subvert your expectations. Miro is someone who could absolutely get by on his shieldhouse and his shieldhouse alone in 99% of all of his fights. But he knows who he is facing here. He knows that if he simply relies on his one and favorite move over and over and over again, he's eventually going to get into trouble. And most importantly, he knows that Olbrychski has this explosive thrust as an option. As such, he does not fall for the trap of capitalizing or getting too aggressive and trying to overwhelm Anton's defense, and instead is able to keep his feet and keep his steady calm long enough to parry this incoming thrust and get a really nice riposte out of it. Now, I've skipped a few exchanges because, frankly, they didn't really showcase any change in game plan, but I am going to look at this one because there is a very definite change in game plan here, again, on the side of Olbrychski. And I've very much intentionally cut off the score at the bottom here because I want to really talk about the changes that people made to their fencing, not necessarily what has been working or what has not been working. Because, in my opinion, one of the ways to really learn from an exchange like this isn't necessarily to think about it as, well, how many points did I score? But how did this particular decision and use of technique counteract some of the things that we've been seeing? And some of the things that we've been seeing so far is, again, Miro's threat of that single-time Shieldhau, and most importantly, the failure of Olbrychski so far to be able to get a really, really clean parry-riposte off of that Shieldhau. The reason the parry-riposte is so difficult is because Miro not only throws a very nice Shieldhau, but he is able to pull off of any Shieldhau in which he is not quite hard parried off to one side and turn it into just another Shieldhau or another cut regardless. Which means that in order to properly defend oneself from this secondary action that he knows is coming, Anton makes an adaptation. He uses his footwork and his distance to bait out the Shieldhau, same as anyone would ever do, and Miro throws that Shieldhau, and it lands in the crossguard of Anton. However, Anton knows that if he simply throws a riposte, same as he ever has before, towards the hands, he's just going to get hit in the head on the afterblow. And that's going to either cancel out his points, or if for some reason something goes wrong, he's going to result in a hit to the head coming through clean. So instead, what he does is he does a sideways lunge and goes into a very deep hang and parry paired with a low right Zverkow. Now, this is something I've been yelled at before by a few judges, and that is, well, turning the back of the head. But more importantly, the idea here is that in order to pull this move off, you have to turn your body to a very, very crazy direction. You have to turn so far to your left that the almost backside of your right shoulder ends up being the furthest point forward in your technique. But the reason this is important is that anytime you throw a right Zverkow, or really a Zverkow in general, you end up in a hanging parry position. Now, normally, this isn't enough to protect you, but if you pair this hanging parry end position with a movement away from where your hanging parry is sitting, you can effectively move your body behind your weapon, taking away a lot of the targets that someone would usually use to hit you back in a riposte. Now, Miro, who threw a Shieldhau on his right side, gets parried and then comes around to throw a shot on his left, which happens to be the exact side that Anton has hanging parried and then moved away from, taking away all the targets that Miro really has open, including the head, and maybe only allowing the arms as a viable target. Meaning that when Anton throws his low right Zverk, he hits either the body or the arms, which in this rule set is really only 1 or 2 points, but it also means that he takes away the head as that viable afterblow target and really hedges his bets, and even at the worst case scenario, this coming out to simply be a double. At the same time, though, he got a really nice parry, a really nice riposte, and now it is on Miro to make sure that his renewal is so well-timed and so on target that he can get around this really effective wall of a defensive measure. Now, in our very next exchange, we see our adaptation from Miro. Though it is a little bit of a similar adaptation that we saw before, what we see here is Anton spring into his showcase-worthy highlight reel thrust. And the reason that Anton tends to land these thrusts is because he's again trying to subvert your expectations. He's waiting for you to get into a headspace where you will just confidently step into range, and then he will full send that thrust right as you're making your step, ensuring that you're not only moving forward, thus decreasing your ability to parry, but also going to eat that thrust so hard that even if he misses, he's going to come crashing into you and hopefully stuff an afterblow. But that is not what happens here. Instead, Miro showcases one of the many capabilities of his Shieldhau and showcases just how calmly and smoothly he can morph a parry riposte that we saw earlier when Anton last threw a thrust into a single time parry and riposte simultaneous action with a Shieldhau. And the reason he is able to pull this off is because Miro has a masterful control over where his Shieldhau travels, and it puts it in such a place that he can expertly push the thrust of Anton just a few inches off to one side, which is more than enough to make it so that not only can he land his shield hell over the top as Anton comes in, but also make sure that Anton's fail-safe of crashing into his opponent to make sure that that afterblow can't come doesn't matter. Because Miro is in such a strong structured position, when that shield hell lands, he even has enough structure and posture to be able to take the full thrust of another person's body launching themselves into his hands, and is able to keep his stance and keep his stature so that he could throw even more afterblows after the fact. This is a really nice adaptation, not only because he is successfully parrying a very difficult to parry thrust, but he's leveled up the response that he had earlier, where he's not only parried and riposted, he has done so at the exact same time. So we're getting towards the end of the fight now, and both fencers are now desperately trying to get into the loop of their opponent and trying to guess basically which adaptation they're each going to make next. And in this exchange, we see two adaptations, one from each fighter, that don't quite work out, but come really close to doing so. The first one occurs when Miro starts threatening some leg shots. And this might seem like a pretty obvious thing to try to do just because leg shots are an easy way to get some points sometimes. But what I think is more important here is that right now, Miro has had a lot of success when Anton has been aggressive and has had middling to okay success when he has been the aggressor. By going for leg shots, you do two things. One, you ensure that if your opponent is being overly defensive, they might get hit. And considering that Anton has been most successful when he has been defensive, this is a really good decision to make. But at the exact same time, the other aspect of this is that Miro has been successful when Anton has been aggressive. And one of the counters to somebody who's going for leg shots is to full send something, maybe like a thrust. If Miro can adequately predict when Anton is going to get offensive in order to try to counteract the leg shots that he's pretending to throw, or may even throw, he might get away with another instance where Anton full sends a thrust and Miro can capitalize on it. However, that doesn't really seem to happen. Instead, what Anton does is another counter adaptation to the adaptations that Miro has been making against him. So Anton knows that whenever he has been aggressive, he has been on the losing end of these exchanges. At the exact same time, he hasn't always come out on top every time he's gone for that parry-riposte, because Miro's shield hao is just so clean and so precise that he is often not able to parry it off far enough to protect himself from a renewal or a remise. So what Anton does instead is, as soon as he sees these little leg shots coming out, he does decide to get aggressive, but he decides to delay and feint his attack. What you see here is he comes forward and he gestures with his hands that he's going to come forward with a very big attack. And we instantly see Miro's response to go up into a guard and to try to protect himself from the thrust that he probably thought was coming. But instead, when that thrust does not come, he does not throw his trademark shield hao. He goes back into defensive posture. And this is probably what Anton was looking to do. Immediately upon seeing that defensive posture, Anton pivots out of his feint and throws a hand shot and immediately tries to exit the exchange. This was the subversion of expectations that he was looking to capitalize on. He wanted to make sure that he did something, one, that he had never done before, and two, one that capitalized on both of the responses that he had seen from Miro so far. One was parrying his thrust and getting a good riposte, and the other was overwhelming him with a volume of shield haos. This was a situation that Anton had created where both of Miro's successful responses so far would not have been adequate. However, Miro did know exactly what to do in this situation. As soon as he recognized that Anton was feinting and was going for that cheeky hand shot, he threw a cheeky hand shot of his own, resulting in a double. And while it's not always great to see doubles, we hate them, whatever, at the end of the day, you have to appreciate the tactical decision-making that is happening in this exchange. No one is so good that every single idea that they ever come up with works out for them. But being able to bail yourself out of a situation that your other person has control of is what really separates a great fencer from the best fencer. So in a lot of ways, Miro's ability to recognize the situation that he was in and throw that hand shot as a response is probably his best case scenario, and as such, he should be applauded for going for it, even if it did again result in a double. So we come now to the final exchange, and with the final exchange, we have our final adaptation. Now, up until now, Olbrychski, as I've said before, has had a lot of success with his parry-ripostes, and perhaps even more success with his interrupting hand shots. Miro has had success getting his shield house out there and making sure that every single time he throws one, he puts Olbrychski on the defensive and makes sure to punish him and his parry-ripostes with a remise to the head. Olbrychski knows that if he doesn't defend his head, it is going to get hit. But Miro has also been getting interrupted on the way in. He has been getting parry-riposted, and although he's been able to bail himself out, he's starting to lose the initiative game. He's starting to not necessarily know when he walks into an exchange whether or not he's going to be aggressive or he's going to be defensive. And while he has managed to bail himself out of many of these situations, that's not always a great thing to rely on. But in this exchange, we see something completely different. We see Miro on the aggressive very early, manipulating the footwork of Olbrychski, but using it as a method of trapping him. One of the ways that Olbrychski loves to subvert the expectations of what you think is going to happen in your exchange is to completely change up his footwork timing so that you don't know whether or not it's safe to be aggressive or safe to be defensive. But in this particular instance, it is Miro who completely controls the footwork. And when he recognizes that when he is very aggressive, Olbrychski backs up. And when he backs up, Olbrychski starts to move back forward. He takes advantage of this pattern, waits for Olbrychski to try to reset his footwork back to neutral, and throws his telltale Shieldhau straight down the pipe and hits Anton right in the head. At the exact same time as he is doing this, he showcases why his Shieldhau is so strong as a simultaneous defensive and offensive measure, because he manages to push off to the side Olbrychski's defensive reactionary thrust. So normally up till now, we saw Olbrychski being the one who dictates when he throws that thrust, and as such gets dangerously close to making it every single time. But this time, that closeness was not there. And the reason it wasn't there is because of the expert level footwork manipulation that Miro was engaging in. He had full dictation over when that thrust was going to come out, and as such, he was able to better time his Shieldhau to utilize its defensive properties and make sure that he was going to be unable to be hit by a thrust in response. As a result, he gets a very key, clean 3 points, which does result in him winning this one single exchange and one single part of the 3-part fight that they go on to have. It's a really great understanding of how you can manipulate distance and timing and footwork to get yourself the situation and the entrance that you really want and you really need. And of course, when you are a skilled Shieldhau practitioner like Miro, that is going to be the key to victory. At the same time, though, remember that just because Miro happened to win this match doesn't mean he won the gold medal. And you have to watch the other 2 following matches if you really want to know who won. But at the end of the day, what you need to make sure to understand is that both of these sets of adaptations that we see from each fencer was key to getting them points throughout this fight. And in the following 2 matches, we see the executions of these same adaptations. Despite the fact that I will not be reviewing those other 2, one, because I don't actually have a recording of the 3rd one, but also because at the end of the day, you've really seen everything you need to see from this one fight. Even though the results might be different, and frankly, I don't really care about the result of the fight. What I care about is that when you see these adaptations and you see these mental games and you see these traps set and paid off, what you need to understand from them is that they are not impossible things for anyone to do. They are things that everybody does. But the reason these 2 people are some of the best fencers in the world isn't because of the tools that they have or even the executions of the tools that they have, but the understanding of the meta-narrative of the fight. They understand what tools their opponent has, what tools their opponents are likely to use, and what adaptations to the tools their opponents are likely to use to try to counteract their own tools. The thing that separates you and makes you one of the best in the world is your ability to get in and maneuver within the mental loop of your opponent, effectively making it so that exchange by exchange, you're the one coming out on top, even in those situations where you screw up. So, That's going to be it for today. Obviously, I'm going to be covering a whole lot of Socal over the next coming weeks because there's a whole lot of crazy cool fights to cover. And if you want to see those, hit the subscribe button or whatever, and I will see you on Thursday.